Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating paradox. Why is it that standard, highly successful corporate change models, the ones that work absolute wonders in the Fortune 500, so often fail spectacularly when they're introduced into multilateral organizations like the United Nations? If you've ever tried to implement a new policy or launch a new system in a highly complex, mandate-driven environment, well, you know exactly the kind of friction I'm talking about. We're going to unpack exactly why that friction happens, and more importantly, what actual systems-based strategies actually work instead. To really wrap our heads around this, consider this fundamental truth from our source material. Authority is negotiated, and legitimacy, not executive command, is the true currency of change. Think about it. In a standard multinational company, a CEO issues a directive, and for the most part, compliance reliably trickles down the chain. But in a multilateral system, authority is delegated, it's heavily layered, and it is widely dispersed. You literally cannot just command transformation from a plush corner office. You've got to build it through trust, through intense negotiation, and by proving its actual value. So, to navigate this huge paradigm shift, our roadmap for today looks like this. First, why classical change fails. Second, understanding the complex adaptive system. Third, bridging the implementation gap. Fourth, we'll look at fatigue, ethics, and risk. And finally, number 5, practical patterns that actually work. All right, let's kick things off with part 1, why classical change fails, or what we can call the illusion of unified authority. So, classical change models like Lewin's whole unfreeze, change, refreeze concept, or Kotter's famous 8 steps, they all build on one massive assumption. They assume a unified command structure. They assume you have an executive board that can simply allocate resources, set a strict timeline, and just enforce compliance. But in the UN, that's just not reality. Authority there is incredibly fragmented across member states, secretariats, governing boards, and wildly diverse field operations. Plus, you have shifting geopolitical mandates that literally change with election cycles and sudden global crises. You simply can't refreeze an organization that has to continuously adapt to real-time global emergencies. It's just not going to happen. Moving right along to part 2, the complex adaptive system, and really understanding the UN ecosystem. This brings us to an absolutely crucial shift in perspective. If we want to succeed here, we have to stop viewing the United Nations as a traditional top-down hierarchy. It's not. It is a complex, living ecosystem. And in a complex adaptive system, causality is nonlinear, meaning you can't just pull a lever at headquarters and expect a neat, predictable result out in the field. For instance, say you make a minor procurement policy adjustment meant to save a few dollars in Geneva. Well, that tiny change can cascade and trigger completely unexpected supply shortages in a field hospital halfway across the globe. Imagine trying to roll out a brand new software system in that kind of environment. It's daunting, right? You have multiple centers of authority you have to appease and a massive diversity of contexts. A policy perfectly designed for a stable, quiet office somehow has to work in a volatile conflict zone with zero cell reception. And the priorities are constantly competing. You have to deliver a life-saving mandate, remain entirely politically neutral, maintain strict budget discipline, and above all, protect your staff. Add in intense reputational sensitivity and the massive headache of interoperating with fragmented legacy IT systems, and yeah, you begin to see exactly why standard change management just collapses under the weight of it all. Because of this sheer complexity and the absolute lack of coercive power, change in the UN only happens when it possesses legitimacy. Remember that quote from earlier? Legitimacy is the currency. What does that actually mean in practice? It means the change has to be actively perceived by the people doing the work as fair, inclusive, evidence-based, and perfectly aligned with core UN values. If a reform lacks that legitimacy, honestly, it doesn't matter how technically perfect this spreadsheet is. It's going to face endless delays, passive-aggressive pushback, or worse, superficial compliance, where people check the box but nothing actually improves. Let's dive into part 3, bridging the implementation gap, specifically looking at headquarters versus field dynamics. Now, one of the absolute biggest friction points where this legitimacy completely breaks down is the massive divide between headquarters and the field. Think about it. Headquarters operates in a highly stable environment. Planners there are, quite rightly, deeply focused on global standardization, procedural rigor, and managing reputational risk. The field, on the other hand, they operate in sheer volatility. They're dealing with constant urgency, rapidly shifting political landscapes, and literal acute physical risks to their staff and the people they're trying to serve every single day. If you have ever sat at headquarters and pulled your hair out because field teams are seemingly just ignoring your brilliant new mandate, I want you to consider this. Their adaptation is often a highly rational response to misaligned design assumptions. They aren't resisting you, they are surviving. Actually, scratch that, they're adapting to survive. A policy that requires uninterrupted, high-speed internet and 3 layers of executive approval simply will not survive contact with a sudden, chaotic humanitarian crisis. Which naturally brings us to part 4, fatigue, ethics, and risk. Let's talk about the human element of transformation. Because look, it's not just about logistics and buggy software systems. Frequent, poorly aligned change initiatives take a massive human toll. When a new change is introduced before the previous reforms have even had a chance to settle, the system just overloads. And it usually starts quietly. People just stop showing up to your consultation workshops. Then you get that passive resistance we talked about. Nominal compliance, but zero behavioral change. Soon, narrative cynicism sets in. You know the one. Oh great, here we go. Just another Flavor of the Month HQ initiative. If you ignore that fatigue, it ultimately boils over into an escalation of formal grievances. And because the UN operates in such incredibly high-risk contexts, any change initiative must undergo a strict, ethical duty of care review right at the design stage. We really have to ask the hard questions here. Are we inadvertently increasing physical risks for our field staff by changing this one security procedure? What is the psychosocial toll of this massive new administrative workload? Have we evaluated if this disproportionately impacts vulnerable groups or national staff? Change in this kind of environment isn't just some dry, bureaucratic process. It affects real lives, real stress levels, and real safety. Okay, part 5, let's get into the good stuff. Practical patterns that work, the multilateral playbook. Now that we understand the deep complexity, the risk of fatigue, and the absolute non-negotiable need for legitimacy, what actually works? Well, first, you've got to map your stakeholders differently. Instead of the standard influence versus interest mapping you learn in business school, you need a 3-dimensional approach that explicitly includes legitimacy. For instance, field leadership might not have massive global influence in New York or Geneva, but they have incredibly high operational legitimacy right there on the ground. If you don't engage them deeply through co-design, your change is going to fail at the implementation level. Guaranteed. Once you know exactly who holds that true legitimacy, you can deploy these 4 proven patterns. Step 1. Build a coalition with extremely clear decision rights. Don't wait around for universal consensus, but do have a core team empowered to actually make the calls. Step 2. Set a minimum viable standard, but, and this is key, explicitly allow for local translation so the field can adapt it safely to their own wild contexts. Step 3. Pilot your changes in representative, high-risk locations. Don't just test it in the comfortable, air-conditioned offices. And finally, step 4, secure visible benefits within one single cycle. You have to prove to people that the change is actually worth the pain early on, otherwise that reform fatigue will eat you alive. And listen, throughout this entire process, you absolutely cannot wait for some giant annual survey to see if the change is working. Change leaders have to continuously monitor the system's health using something lightweight, like a readiness pulse survey, asking just 5 simple questions, like checking their clarity on the change, their trust in leadership, whether they actually have the capacity to adapt, if they know where to give feedback, and if they perceive any real value to their daily work. Doing this helps you catch and fix small issues way before they harden into entrenched, stubborn resistance. So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. Take a hard look at your current projects. Are your reforms truly built for the messy, on-the-ground realities of a complex adaptive system? Or are you still trying to command an ecosystem? When we finally respect the complexity of multilateral organizations, we stop fighting the system itself, and we start designing transformations that actually stick. Thank you so much for joining me today, and keep exploring.